Montana Territory, 1883. A woman steps down from a stagecoach into the eerie silence of a deserted street. Her gloved hands clutch a letter bearing a stranger's hopeful promises. Her eyes scan the boarded-up buildings, searching for signs of the man whose portrait she's carried across 1,000 miles of wilderness. The town she traveled so far to reach appears abandoned. Only hastily painted quarantine signs and locked doors greet her arrival. But destiny rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves. What awaits her will test the limits of her courage and reveal that sometimes our true calling emerges only when all our carefully laid plans crumble to dust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early October wind cut through Eleanor Blackwood's woolen traveling coat as the stagecoach from Billings lurched to an unexpected stop. The journey west had consumed nearly 3 weeks of constant motion, each mile stretching the thread connecting her to her former life in Philadelphia, until it finally snapped somewhere around the Missouri River. "White Rock," announced the driver, a weathered man named Thatcher, who had maintained an unsettling silence for the past several hours of their journey. "End of the line for you, miss." Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles from her practical Navy traveling dress, once considered elegant in Philadelphia, but now clearly inadequate for the Montana autumn. The wind pressed against her like an unwelcome stranger, making even the simple act of gathering her composure a challenge. "There must be some mistake," she said, her gaze moving between the driver and the deserted main street. The small frontier town appeared completely abandoned, with no movement visible except tattered quarantine notices flapping in the wind. No smoke rose from any chimney. No horses stood hitched outside the saloon, and no Thomas Bennett came striding forward to greet his mail-order bride. Thatcher spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "No mistake, ma'am. This here's White Rock, or what's left of it after the fever came through." Inside her modest carpetbag lay her most precious possessions, a small leather portfolio containing her nursing certificates from Philadelphia General Hospital, $178 in carefully counted banknotes, and a daguerreotype of her parents, both claimed by influenza 3 years earlier. None of the scattered, boarded-up businesses knew that the unassuming woman standing beside the stagecoach carried enough medical knowledge to assist in complex surgeries, and enough determination to cross a continent alone, despite warnings from everyone she'd ever known. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked the driver, scanning the empty street for any sign of human presence. Was there an illness?" The word "dead" caught in her throat, unwilling to be voiced. Thatcher's leathery face creased in what might have been sympathy. "Can't rightly say, miss. Fever hit hard 2 weeks back. Some fled, some died, some holed up in their homes. Who's under quarantine by order of the territorial governor. Shouldn't even be dropping you here, truth told." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. After 14 months of correspondence, she had traveled halfway across the country to marry Thomas Bennett, whose letters had painted a picture of a modest but thriving medical practice in a growing frontier town. His last letter had explicitly stated he would meet her at the stagecoach stop on this very day. "There must be some mistake," she repeated, her voice barely audible over the wind whistling through the abandoned buildings. "Easy to write pretty words," Thatcher replied, already unloading her trunk onto the hard-packed earth. "Harder to survive when sickness comes calling." Within moments, the driver was climbing back onto his seat, eager to depart before the fading daylight made the dangerous trail back to Billings even more treacherous. "Stage comes through again next Tuesday, if you're aiming to head back east," he offered, then hesitated. "Though if you was smart, you'd come with me now. Ain't safe here with the fever about." Eleanor stood frozen, weighing her limited options. Return immediately to Billings on a stagecoach that offered no guarantee of lodging upon arrival, or remain in a quarantine town where her intended husband might be dead or fled. Before she could decide, Thatcher made the choice for her. "Sorry, miss, can't delay." With the flick of the reins, the stagecoach lurched forward, leaving Eleanor standing alone with her trunk and carpet bag in front of what appeared to be a shuttered general store. Eleanor watched as the stagecoach disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving her standing alone in the middle of a ghost town. The brutal reality of her situation slowly sank in. She was alone in a strange territory with limited funds and no immediate prospects. The man she had come to marry was nowhere to be found, and the town appeared ravaged by some contagious illness. A sound from the direction of a building marked White Rock Medical Office caught her attention. She turned to see a tall figure emerging. From the doorway, a man with copper skin and angular features that spoke of mixed heritage. His jet-black hair was pulled back, and despite the circumstances, his clothes were clean and professional, though clearly worn from overuse. Most striking were his eyes, almost amber in color, and reflecting a weariness that suggested days without proper rest. "Ma'am," he called, approaching cautiously, "are you lost?" "I'm Eleanor Blackwood," she replied, straightening her spine and summoning what dignity she could. "I was to meet Thomas Bennett here today." The man's expression shifted to one of unmistakable pity. "I'm Dr. James Hawkins. You'd better come inside, Miss Blackwood." The name struck her immediately. "Dr. Hawkins? Thomas mentioned you in his letters. You're his colleague?" "His mentor," Hawkins corrected, his voice carrying the faintest accent she couldn't place. "And I'm afraid you've had a wasted journey." Eleanor felt her heart sink as she followed Dr. Hawkins toward the medical office, leaving her trunk where it stood. As they walked, he maintained a careful distance, his movements precise and measured. "The fever came 3 weeks ago," he explained, his deep voice matter-of-fact, "likely brought by miners from the southern camps. Thomas attended the first cases before I returned from treating the Blackfoot to the north." They reached the doorway of the medical office, where Hawkins paused, studying her carefully. Thomas was among the first to fall ill. His condition deteriorated rapidly. "Is he—" Eleanor couldn't finish the question. "He's alive," Hawkins said, "but he left on yesterday's train to Denver. His lungs were too damaged to remain in this climate, especially with winter approaching. He'll require specialized treatment for months, possibly years." Eleanor processed this information with a strange detachment. The man she had intended to marry, whose carefully composed letters had guided her across the continent, had departed without waiting for her arrival, without leaving any message, without any apparent thought to the woman who had abandoned everything. To join him, there was no telegram, she said, the realization dawning. "He made no attempt to warn me not to come." Hawkins's expression remained carefully neutral. "Communication has been limited since the quarantine, and Thomas was not entirely lucid in his final days here." Before Eleanor could respond, a series of harsh coughs echoed from inside the medical office. Hawkins's attention immediately shifted, his professional demeanor taking precedence over social niceties. "I have patients who need attention, Miss Blackwood," he said, his tone apologetic but firm. "Normally I'd direct you to the hotel, but it's closed due to the quarantine. Most establishments are." Eleanor glanced down the deserted street, the reality of her situation becoming increasingly dire with each passing moment. No lodging, no fiancé, and apparently no way to leave until the stage returned in a week, if it returned at all, during a quarantine. "Your nursing certificates," Hawkins said suddenly, gesturing toward her carpet bag. "Thomas mentioned in passing that his intended bride had some medical training." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Yes, I trained at Philadelphia General for 3 years. Have you treated infectious fevers before? Typhoid? Diphtheria?" "Yes, extensively," she replied, momentarily forgetting her personal predicament. "I assisted Dr. Harrison in the fever ward during the outbreak of '79. Something shifted in Hawkins's amber eyes. A calculation, an assessment. How current is your knowledge of antiseptic procedures? Are you familiar with Lister's methods? Completely, Eleanor said, straightening her posture. I've been implementing carbolic acid solutions for 2 years now, despite resistance from older physicians. For the first time, a hint of approval crossed Hawkins's face. He glanced back, inside, at the sound of another painful cough, then turned to Eleanor with clear decision in his eyes. Miss Blackwood, I have 17 patients and no assistant. The town's only other doctor fled last week, and my nurse succumbed to the fever 3 days ago. I haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a week. He gestured toward the silent town. There's no accommodation available for you here. The next stage may or may not come, depending on how strictly they enforce the quarantine. Hawkins squared his shoulders. I'm offering you a position as my medical assistant. In exchange, you'll have lodging in the rooms above the office and meals as regular as we can manage. Once the quarantine lifts, you'll have your salary and fare to wherever you choose to go. The proposition, though clearly born of desperation, highlighted the precariousness of Eleanor's position. A proper Philadelphia lady would never consider accepting such an arrangement with a stranger, particularly one of mixed heritage, which would raise eyebrows even in progressive circles back east. But Philadelphia was 2,000 miles and a lifetime away, and Eleanor Blackwood had not traveled across the continent to retreat at the first sign of adversity. That's very conditional, Dr. Hawkins, she said finally, but under the circumstances, I would be grateful to accept your offer. Hawkins nodded, once briskly, then turned toward the door. Leave your trunk for now. We'll have it brought in later. Your medical skills are needed immediately. As Eleanor followed him into the building that would now be both her workplace and temporary home, she wondered what strange twist of fate had led her here. Not to the respectable marriage she had anticipated, but to a quarantined town with a half-Comanche doctor who clearly had no time for social niceties. Whatever lay ahead, it was certainly not the future she had envisioned while reading Thomas Bennett's flowery letters in her Philadelphia boarding house. Yet as she heard the labored breathing of patients from the next room, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of purpose rising within her, the same purpose that had first drawn her to nursing despite her family's objections. Perhaps, she thought as she removed her gloves and reached for the basin to wash her hands, destiny had brought her exactly where she needed to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The medical office was a stark contrast to the pristine hospital wards Eleanor had known in Philadelphia. Though clean and organized, it bore the unmistakable signs of being overwhelmed: surgical instruments soaking in carbolic solution, bandages hastily folded, and medicine bottles arranged with practical efficiency rather than perfect alignment. Prepare yourself, Dr. Hawkins warned as he led her toward a back room that had been converted into a makeshift ward. Most are past the critical stage, but 3 remain seriously ill. Eleanor steeled herself, drawing on years of experience in Philadelphia's worst fever outbreaks. Nothing could have fully prepared her for what awaited. 8 pallets lined the walls of the room, each occupied by patients in various states of recovery. The air hung heavy with the sharp scent of carbolic acid, barely masking the underlying smells of illness. Most striking was the silence, not the absence of sound, but the eerie quiet of the desperately ill conserving their strength merely to breathe. Mrs. Parsons, Hawkins indicated, moving to the bedside of an elderly woman whose labored breathing punctuated the room's stillness. Fever broke yesterday, but her lungs remained compromised. Eleanor fell instantly into her professional role, assessing the woman's color, respiration, and the subtle signs that experienced nurses recognize instinctively. Fluids maintained? She asked, noting the woman's parched lips. As best we could with limited help, Hawkins replied, his tone neither defensive nor apologetic, simply factual. Moving methodically from patient to patient, he briefed her on each case with remarkable precision. Mr. Delaney, the blacksmith, recovering but weak from prolonged fever. The Wilcox boy, only 12, finally sleeping naturally after days of delirium. Reverend Sampson, improving but requiring regular steam treatments for his damaged lungs. When they reached the final 3 patients, segregated slightly from the others, Hawkins's expression grew more grave. These are our critical cases. Margaret Fisher contracted the fever while nursing her husband before he died. The Chen brothers work at the laundry. Both fell ill simultaneously 3 days ago. Eleanor studied the patients with practiced eyes. The younger brother's breathing is too shallow. Has he been positioned to clear his lungs regularly? A flash of approval crossed Hawkins's face. When possible. Without adequate assistance, some protocols have been compromised. "Show me your supplies," Eleanor requested, already mentally cataloguing what would be needed for proper care. Hawkins led her to a supply cabinet that revealed both the doctor's resourcefulness and the dire limitations of frontier medicine. Shelf. Space dedicated to critical medicines was alarmingly sparse. Quinine in limited supply, laudanum nearly depleted, and barely enough carbolic acid to maintain antiseptic conditions for another week. "The quarantine has prevented supply deliveries," Hawkins explained, watching her take inventory. "I've been rationing everything, prioritizing antiseptics over comfort medications." "A sound decision," Eleanor affirmed, recognizing the difficult choices he'd been forced to make alone. "Though if we had willow bark, we could brew a tea to reduce fevers without depleting the quinine." Hawkins paused, regarding her with new interest. "There's a grove of willows by the creek south of town. I've used the bark before, but haven't had time to collect more. I'll prepare a list of other botanical alternatives we might find locally," Eleanor offered. "In Philadelphia, we sometimes relied on traditional remedies when hospital supplies ran low during outbreaks." For the first time, Hawkins's professional reserve softened slightly. "My mother was Comanche. She taught me their healing ways before. I went east for medical training. I've incorporated some of her knowledge when Western medicine falls short." This revelation explained much about the doctor's unusual approach that Eleanor had already noticed. The particular positioning of patients to aid breathing, the specific blends of steam treatments, and the careful attention to light and air flow throughout the clinic. "I would welcome learning any effective treatments regardless of origin," Eleanor said sincerely. "Medicine should embrace wisdom wherever it's found." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden, desperate coughing from Margaret Fisher's bed. They rushed to find the woman struggling for breath, her lips taking on the alarming bluish tinge that Eleanor recognized all too well from the Philadelphia wards. Without exchanging a word, they fell into synchronized action. Hawkins supported the woman into a sitting position while Eleanor prepared a steam treatment, adding a few drops from a small, unmarked bottle that Hawkins indicated with a nod. "Breathe as deeply as you can, Mrs. Fisher," Hawkins instructed, his voice taking on a gentleness Eleanor hadn't heard before. "The steam will help clear your lungs." For 20 minutes they worked together, Eleanor monitoring the woman's pulse and respiration while Hawkins maintained the steam treatment. Gradually, Mrs. Fisher's breathing eased, the desperate struggle subsiding into merely labored breaths. "What was in that bottle?" Eleanor asked quietly, after they had settled Mrs. Fisher back onto her pillow. "Mullein and wild cherry bark with a small amount of lobelia," Hawkins replied. "A modification of both my mother's remedy and Western practice. It opens the airways when traditional treatments fail." Eleanor nodded, impressed by the effectiveness of the treatment. "We should document the formula and results. Such innovations could benefit patients beyond White Rock." Hawkins appeared momentarily startled by her suggestion, but nodded in agreement. "I've kept records, though I've had little time to organize them properly." As the immediate crisis passed, Hawkins showed Eleanor to a small room at the rear of the clinic that would serve as her quarters. The space was spare but clean. A narrow bed with fresh linens, a washstand, a small desk, and a chest of drawers constituted the entirety of the furnishings. "It's not much," he apologized, lighting the small lamp on the desk. "My quarters are upstairs if you need assistance during the night." "It will serve admirably," Eleanor assured him, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion that her professional focus had temporarily held at bay. The day's shocks and disappointments crashed over her now, the abandoned town, Thomas's absence, and the sudden dramatic change in her circumstances. Hawkins seemed to read her state accurately. "Rest for 2 hours, I'll manage. After that I'll need relief to get some sleep myself." His direct manner might have seemed brusque in other circumstances, but Eleanor recognized it as the necessary efficiency of a physician stretched beyond normal limits. Left alone, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to absorb the magnitude of her situation. The carefully constructed future she had imagined, a respectable marriage to a frontier doctor, a fresh start in the West, escape from the limited options available to a spinster nurse in Philadelphia, had disintegrated with each revelation. About Thomas Bennett. From her carpet bag, she withdrew the packet of letters that had guided her across the continent. 16 letters, each bearing the same meticulous handwriting. She had believed herself cautious, insisting on corresponding for a full year before agreeing to travel west. Bennett's letters had been consistent, detailed, and seemingly sincere. He had described the growing town, his medical practice, and his desire for a wife who would understand his dedication to healing. Had it all been genuine, cut short only by the unfortunate timing of the epidemic? Or had there been elements of deception in his careful prose? Would the real Thomas Bennett have been a suitable husband? Or had she narrowly escaped binding her life to someone who would abandon her at the first sign of adversity? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Hawkins had returned with a tray bearing a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. "You'll need sustenance," he said, setting the tray on the small desk. "The next days will be demanding." "Dr. Hawkins," she called as he turned to go. Was Dr. Bennett a good physician?" The doctor paused, considering his words carefully. "He was technically skilled and well-educated," he said finally, "but there was always something cautious in him. He preferred predictable cases and controlled environments." He hesitated. "His departure didn't surprise me when it came. Some men aren't suited for frontier medicine, where conditions are rarely ideal and resources seldom adequate." After he left, Eleanor used the basin to wash away the dust of travel, changing into her simplest day dress behind the privacy screen in the corner. The simple act of cleansing restored some measure of her composure. As she ate the modest meal, she forced herself to consider her options logically. The quarantine eliminated immediate departure as a possibility, even had she wanted to retreat. Her nursing skills were genuinely needed here, perhaps more than they had ever been in Philadelphia's well-staffed hospital. And while Dr. Hawkins was clearly competent, he was fighting a losing battle against exhaustion. For at least the coming days, her path was clear. She would fulfill her professional duty as a nurse, assisting Hawkins in containing the epidemic. What came after that could be decided when the immediate crisis passed. This decision made, Eleanor rose and smoothed her dress, checking that her hair was secured in its practical style. Whatever strange twist of fate had brought her to White Rock, she would face it with the same composure and determination that had carried her through the wards of Philadelphia General during its worst outbreaks. Tomorrow, she would send a telegram to her former landlady in Philadelphia, explaining the change in circumstances and requesting that any mail be forwarded to White Rock's postal station. Tonight, she would provide Dr. Hawkins the relief he desperately needed, allowing him a few hours of uninterrupted rest. As she prepared to return to the ward, Eleanor realized that for the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt truly essential, not merely useful but necessary in a way that transcended social convention. Thomas Bennett's absence, initially devastating, might prove to be the very circumstance that offered her something beyond the limited future she had envisioned as a frontier doctor's wife. With this thought providing unexpected comfort, Eleanor Blackwood stepped back into the ward, ready to begin her first night as White Rock's new nurse during the darkest hours of its quarantine. Dawn arrived with the muted golden light of autumn filtering through the clinic's windows. Eleanor had maintained vigil through the night, moving quietly between patients, adjusting positions, administering medicines, and ensuring comfortable breathing for those still struggling with congested lungs. The younger Chen brother had given her the greatest concern, his fever spiking dangerously near midnight before finally breaking in the early morning hours. She heard Hawkins before she saw him, his footsteps on the stairs followed by his appearance in the doorway. Despite the few hours of rest, exhaustion still lined his face, though his eyes were clearer. "Report," he requested simply, moving immediately to check Margaret Fisher, their most critical patient. Mrs. Fisher's breathing remained labored, but stable through the night, Eleanor began, falling into the concise medical reporting she'd practiced at Philadelphia General. The Wilcox boy slept without incident. Mr. Delaney complained of chest pain at approximately 2 o'clock. I administered willow bark tea from our existing supply, which provided relief. The elder Chen brother's fever has remained moderate, while the younger's broke at approximately 3:30 after reaching a concerning peak. Hawkins nodded, checking Mrs. Fisher's pulse with practiced fingers. "Your assessment of their conditions?" Mrs. Fisher and the younger Chen brother remain critical but improving. The others are progressing as expected, though Mr. Delaney's chest pain warrants monitoring for potential cardiac involvement. A hint of surprise flashed across Hawkins's face at her thorough analysis, quickly replaced by professional appreciation. "Your observations match mine. The chest pain in post-fever recovery often indicates inflammation of the heart muscle. We'll watch for additional symptoms." He completed his examination of the patients before turning back to Eleanor. "You should rest now. I can manage for several hours." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. "Wake me if there's any change in their conditions." Back in her small room, Eleanor managed only to remove her shoes before collapsing onto the narrow bed. Despite her physical fatigue, her mind continued processing the strange turn her life had taken in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she had awakened on the stagecoach with nervous anticipation about meeting her future husband. Now she found herself serving as nurse in a quarantined town under the direction of a Half-Comanche doctor she barely knew. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come west partly to escape the limitations placed on her as a nurse in Philadelphia, where the male doctors increasingly restricted female nurses to basic care, rather than allowing them to use their full medical knowledge. Thomas Bennett's letters had suggested he valued female medical practitioners more progressively. Now she found herself working alongside Dr. Hawkins, who seemed to assess her solely on her capabilities rather than social conventions. The unexpected freedom of this arrangement struck her as she drifted into exhausted sleep. She awoke to knocking several hours later. The light suggested early afternoon, meaning she'd slept longer than intended. "Miss Blackwood," Hawkins called through the door. "I apologize for disturbing your rest, but we have a situation that requires attention." Eleanor hastily pinned up her hair and straightened her rumpled dress before opening the door. "What's happened?" "Sheriff Walsh has returned to town." Hawkins explained, leading her toward the front of the clinic. He's brought 3 miners from the southern camp who are showing symptoms. 1 is in serious condition. In the clinic's front room stood a broad-shouldered man in a dust-covered sheriff's uniform. Despite his obvious exhaustion, he maintained an authoritative presence as he directed 2 miners in carrying a third through the doorway. "Doc," he acknowledged Hawkins with a nod before his eyes widened slightly at Eleanor's appearance. "Ma'am." "Sheriff Walsh, this is Miss Blackwood, a trained nurse who arrived yesterday." Hawkins introduced her with brisk efficiency. "She'll be assisting with patient care during the quarantine." "Nurse, eh?" The sheriff studied her with undisguised curiosity. "Didn't expect to find new medical help in town, especially not a lady from back east." "Circumstances change, Sheriff," Eleanor replied evenly. "Let's focus on your patient." The miner they carried was clearly in dire condition, feverish, barely conscious, and struggling for each breath. Eleanor immediately helped direct them to place him in an examination room, separate from the recovering patients. "How long has he been symptomatic?" Hawkins asked, already beginning his examination. "Started coughing 2 days ago," Walsh replied. "Fever hit hard last night, found him collapsed in his cabin this morning when I was checking the southern camps." Walsh nodded toward the waiting area where the other 2 miners sat. "These 2 are just starting to show signs. Coughing, feverish. Figured it best to bring them all in rather than leave them isolated at the camp." "A wise decision," Hawkins confirmed. "Miss Blackwood, prepare the steam treatment with the Mullin mixture for this patient. Sheriff, I'll need to examine the others immediately." As Eleanor prepared the treatment, she observed the interaction between Hawkins and the sheriff. Despite the professional courtesy they showed each other, an underlying tension was evident. "Town's like a ghost haunt, Doc," Walsh commented, as Hawkins examined one of the miners. "The territorial governor's man was through yesterday, enforcing the quarantine. Threatened to post guards if people try leaving. The quarantine is necessary." Hawkins replied without looking up from his examination. "This fever spreads rapidly and kills efficiently. Containing it is our only option. May be necessary, but it's killing the town just as sure as the fever," Walsh countered. "Supplies running low everywhere. Wilson at the Mercantile says he's got maybe a week of flour left. The Hendersons ran out of milk for their young ones after their cow died last week." "Better temporary hardship than permanent loss," Hawkins responded, his tone indicating a long-standing disagreement. "The fever shows signs of abating in our initial patients. If no new cases develop, the quarantine might lift within 2 weeks." Walsh's expression suggested skepticism. 2 weeks might be too late for some folks' provisions. He glanced toward Eleanor as she worked. "No offense, miss, but your arrival complicates things. Governor's man made it clear. No one in or out means exactly that." Eleanor paused her preparation of the steam treatment. "Are you suggesting I've violated the quarantine, Sheriff?" "Not suggesting anything," Walsh replied, though his expression indicated otherwise. "Just noting that rules are rules, even for pretty Eastern ladies." Hawkins straightened, fixing the sheriff with a level gaze. "Miss Blackwood arrived before you returned with the governor's official quarantine orders. She's now essential medical personnel in a town with an outbreak. Unless you'd prefer to assist with treating these fever cases yourself." The challenge hung in the air until Walsh finally shrugged. "Just doing my job, Doc. Governor's man left me responsible for enforcing the quarantine. And I'm responsible for treating the ill," Hawkins countered. "Miss Blackwood stays as my medical assistant." The exchange revealed much about White Rock's dynamics that Eleanor filed away for later consideration. For now, the critical miner required her complete attention. His condition was worse than any of their current patients, suggesting either a stronger exposure to the contagion or an underlying weakness that made him more susceptible. When the sheriff finally departed, having arranged for the miners to remain under medical care, Eleanor administered the steam treatment to the critical patient, while Hawkins settled the other two into the recovery ward. "The sheriff seemed concerned about my presence," Eleanor observed when Hawkins returned. "Walsh is a good lawman, but lacks medical understanding," Hawkins replied, checking the steam treatment's effectiveness. "He sees the quarantine as an inconvenience, rather than a necessity." He adjusted the position of the barely conscious miner to improve his breathing. "You've now been officially claimed as essential medical personnel. The territorial governor won't challenge that designation during an outbreak." Eleanor recognized the significance of his declaration. Hawkins had essentially taken responsibility for her presence, potentially risking his professional standing if the authorities questioned her arrival during quarantine restrictions. "Thank you for your support," she said quietly. "Though I suspect the sheriff will be watching my movements carefully." "Walsh watches everyone carefully," Hawkins replied with the hint of a smile. "It's his nature as much as his job. But he's fair-minded beneath his brusque manner." As they worked together to stabilize the critical miner, Eleanor observed Hawkins's techniques with growing appreciation. His methods combined rigorous Western medical practices with subtle adaptations she'd never encountered in Philadelphia. The positioning of fever patients, the specific herbal additions to standard treatments, and his careful attention to air quality all reflected an integrated approach to medicine that transcended her formal training. "Your treatment approach is quite innovative," she noted, as they completed the initial care, "particularly your modifications to the standard fever protocols." Hawkins paused, seeming to consider whether to elaborate. "I studied at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia," he finally said. "But I found their approaches sometimes incomplete. My mother's people understood aspects of healing that Western medicine overlooks." "Such as?" Eleanor prompted, genuinely curious. "The connection between breath and recovery, the importance of natural light cycles for healing, the specific properties of local plants that laboratory medicine hasn't yet identified." He spoke matter-of-factly, without defensiveness. "I integrate what works and discard what doesn't, regardless of its origin." Eleanor recognized the significance of his willingness to share this perspective. As a half-Comanche physician in a white frontier town, acknowledging his indigenous medical influences likely invited skepticism from many patients. "A pragmatic approach that benefits your patients," she observed. "Medicine should evolve through proven results rather than rigid adherence to tradition." Something in Hawkins's expression shifted, a subtle relaxation of the professional reserve he maintained. "Few Western-trained practitioners share that view, in my experience. Perhaps because few have witnessed the limitations of Western medicine as clearly as I did in Philadelphia's fever wards," Eleanor replied. "When standard treatments fail repeatedly, one becomes more open to alternatives." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden decline in the miner's condition, his breathing becoming dangerously shallow despite the steam treatment. Without exchanging words, they moved into coordinated action, Eleanor preparing the herbal tincture while Hawkins elevated the patient's position to maximize air intake. The crisis passed after 20 tense minutes, the miner's breathing stabilizing into a less alarming pattern. Only then did Eleanor realize they had worked in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's needs and movements as though they had practiced together for years rather than hours. This natural medical compatibility struck her as remarkable. In Philadelphia, she had worked with doctors for months before achieving such seamless coordination. With Hawkins, it had developed almost instantly, based on mutual respect for skill and shared focus on patient outcomes above all else. As evening approached, bringing with it the most difficult hours for fever patients. Eleanor recognized that their professional alliance had already transcended the desperate arrangement of necessity it had begun as mere hours ago. Whatever came after the quarantine lifted, this unexpected partnership was already providing her with a level of professional fulfillment she had never experienced in Philadelphia's restrictive medical hierarchy. For the first time since stepping down from the stagecoach into White Rock's deserted street, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival or temporary accommodation. Here, in this unlikely place, her medical knowledge was being fully utilized rather than artificially constrained by convention. 3 days into Eleanor's unexpected tenure at the White Rock Clinic, the rhythm of frontier medicine had become her new normal. The critical minor, identified as Patrick Donnelly, had stabilized but remained seriously ill. Margaret Fisher had turned the corner toward recovery, while the Chen brothers progressed steadily under their care. Daybreak found Eleanor gathering fresh willow bark near the creek south of town, the early morning light casting long shadows across the landscape. Hawkins had reluctantly agreed she could venture this far from the clinic after she pointed out their dwindling medical supplies demanded creative solutions. "Don't stray beyond the creek," he had cautioned, "and return immediately if you encounter anyone." The autumn air carried a crisp bite that invigorated Eleanor after the stale atmosphere of the sick room. She worked efficiently, cutting strips of bark and placing them in her gathering basket while keeping vigilant watch for any signs of trouble. Sheriff Walsh's concerned reaction to her presence still lingered in her mind, suggesting that not everyone in White Rock might welcome a newcomer during these precarious times. A sound from the nearby trees drew her attention. Footsteps, too, deliberate to be wildlife. Eleanor tensed, calculating the distance back to town. "You'd be the doctor's new helper, I reckon," came a woman's voice, followed by the appearance of an older Native American woman whose silver-streaked black hair was pulled into a neat braid. Though her dress was a practical frontier style, her moccasins and the beaded bag at her waist spoke to her tribal heritage. "I am," Eleanor acknowledged cautiously. "Eleanor Blackwood, nurse to Dr. Hawkins." The woman studied her with keen, dark eyes that missed nothing. "Sarah Whitehorse," she offered. "Finally, I bring herbs to James when townfolks aren't watching too close." The casual use of Hawkins' first name indicated a familiarity that piqued Eleanor's curiosity. "You know Dr. Hawkins well?" A smile touched the woman's weathered face. "Taught him to identify healing plants before he could walk properly. His mother was my cousin." This unexpected connection to Hawkins's past caught Eleanor by surprise. "You're his family?" "What's left of it," Sarah confirmed, her expression revealing. "Nothing more." She nodded toward Eleanor's basket. "Willow bark is good, but not enough for lung fever. You need more." Without waiting for a response, she reached into her beaded bag and extracted several small bundles of dried plants. Elderflower for breaking fever, mullein for opening the breath paths, yarrow for when bleeding shows in the cough. Eleanor accepted the offerings with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. Our supplies are running dangerously low." Sarah's gaze was penetrating. "Why does a Philadelphia nurse come to marry a man she's never met in a frontier town?" The blunt question startled Eleanor, both in its directness and the accurate knowledge of her origins. "How did you—" "James told me," Sarah interrupted. "He worries you might leave once quarantine lifts, says you work well together." This revelation, that Hawkins had discussed her with his relative, suggested more personal consideration than he had displayed in their professional interactions. "I came seeking purpose beyond the limitations placed on women in Eastern medicine," Eleanor answered truthfully. "Though I didn't anticipate finding it through a quarantine rather than marriage." Sarah nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "Sometimes the path we walk isn't the one we first stepped onto." She gestured toward town. James is good healer, walks in two worlds, knows medicines from both. Hard for him here sometimes. Eleanor understood the unspoken reality. A half-Comanche. Doctor would face prejudice regardless of his medical skill or education. The patients respect him, she offered. When they're dying, yes, Sarah replied with blunt pragmatism. When they're well, some forget their gratitude. She secured her bag and prepared to leave. Come here same time in 3 days. I'll bring more medicines. Before Eleanor could respond further, Sarah disappeared into the trees with remarkable stealth for a woman of her years. The encounter left Eleanor contemplating the complex layers of Hawkins's existence in White Rock, respected as a physician, yet potentially ostracized for his heritage, walking the delicate boundary between two worlds. She returned to the clinic to find Hawkins changing Patrick Donnelly's bandages, the miner finally conscious enough to respond to basic questions. Miss Blackwood, Hawkins acknowledged her entrance. Mr. Donnelly has regained lucidity this morning. The miner, a wiry man perhaps in his 40s, regarded Eleanor with confusion. Another angel come to tend me? Must be worse off than I thought. I assure you I'm quite real, Mr. Donnelly, Eleanor replied as she set down her basket. And your improved awareness suggests you're better, not worse. Hawkins noticed the herb bundles immediately. You found more than willow bark. I had unexpected assistance, Eleanor explained, relating her encounter with Sarah Whitehorse, while they worked together to prepare fresh treatments for their patients. Hawkins's expression remained carefully neutral at the mention of his relative. Sarah rarely shows herself to outsiders. Her willingness to share medicines with you is significant. She seems concerned about the town's attitude toward you, Eleanor observed carefully. With good reason, Hawkins replied after a moment's hesitation. White Rock tolerates my presence because I'm the only doctor who's remained consistently through drought, harsh winters, and now fever. Tolerance isn't acceptance. He focused on grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, the rhythmic motion seeming to help order his thoughts. Before the epidemic, the town council was considering funding to bring another physician from Denver, one without my complicated heritage. The admission revealed vulnerabilities Hawkins had carefully concealed beneath his professional demeanor. That seems remarkably short-sighted given your evident skill, Eleanor commented, indignation coloring her tone. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Your Eastern directness is refreshing, Miss Blackwood. Most here would dance around the reality with polite fictions. Their conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Walsh's arrival, his expression more serious than during his previous visit. Doc, Miss Blackwood, he greeted them with a tip of his hat. Got a situation brewing that you should know about. Mayor Hargrove is holding an emergency town council meeting about the quarantine. Some folks are pushing to break it. Say they'd rather risk the fever than starve their families. Hawkins's expression hardened. Breaking quarantine now would spread the fever throughout the territory. I know that, Walsh said defensively. Just delivering the message. Hargrove wants you at the meeting to explain the medical necessities. 4 o'clock at his home. His gaze shifted to Eleanor. Both of you, actually. Some council members are curious about our new nurse and her credentials. After the sheriff departed, Hawkins's frustration was evident as he aggressively ground herbs into powder. Politics, he muttered, always interfering with medicine. Is there genuine concern about food supplies? Eleanor asked, recognizing that medical priorities sometimes overlooked practical realities. Hawkins paused his work, considering her question seriously. Yes, White Rock wasn't prepared for extended isolation. The freight wagons that usually arrive weekly haven't come since the quarantine was implemented. Some families, particularly those with children, are facing difficult circumstances. Eleanor recalled her training at Philadelphia General during outbreaks. In Philadelphia, we organize supply distribution during quarantines, pooling resources, and ensuring fair allocation to prevent hoarding. White Rock lacks Philadelphia's organizational structure, Hawkins noted, though his expression suggested interest in the concept. But it has a doctor and nurse who understand both medical necessities and human needs, Eleanor countered. Perhaps we could present a compromise at this meeting, maintaining medical quarantine while implementing structured resource sharing. The suggestion seemed to intrigue Hawkins. A practical middle path that addresses both contagion control and survival needs. He studied her with growing respect. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Blackwood." As they prepared for the town council meeting, Eleanor selected her most formal remaining dress, a practical navy blue with minimal trim that still conveyed professional dignity. Her appearance would matter at this gathering where her credentials and presence were apparently in question. "What should I know about Mayor Hargrove and the council before we meet them?" she asked as they walked toward the wealthier residential area of town. "Hargrove owns the largest mercantile in White Rock," Hawkins explained. "Generally fair-minded but protective of business interests above all else. The council consists of Wilson from the smaller general store, Bancroft who runs the sawmill, Mrs. Henderson who owns the hotel, and Reverend Taylor who leads the community church. And their likely positions on the quarantine." "Divided," Hawkins replied. "Hargrove and Mrs. Henderson initially supported stringent measures, while Wilson and Bancroft worried about economic impacts from the beginning. Reverend Taylor tends to mediate between factions." They approached a substantial two-story house at the edge of town, clearly the residence of someone with significant resources compared to the modest structures that comprised most of White Rock. "One more thing," Hawkins said quietly before they reached the door. "Your background as Thomas Bennett's intended bride will likely arise. The council may question your qualifications and intentions, perhaps suggesting you should be confined separately as a new arrival rather than working alongside me." Eleanor straightened her spine, summoning the professional dignity that had carried her through numerous challenges in Philadelphia's medical hierarchy. "Let them question. My nursing credentials are legitimate. My intentions are to save lives. And my presence is already providing essential medical support during a crisis." The resolute confidence in her voice earned a rare smile from Hawkins. "Then let's face White Rock's leadership together, Miss Blackwood." As they entered Mayor Hargrove's parlor, 5 pairs of eyes turned to assess them, some with open curiosity, others with barely concealed suspicion. The room's tense atmosphere suggested difficult negotiations ahead, with both medical necessity and Eleanor's unforeseen presence in White Rock clearly on the agenda. Eleanor met their scrutiny with composed professionalism, standing tall beside Dr. Hawkins as they prepared to defend both the quarantine measures and her unexpected but increasingly vital role in White Rock's medical crisis. Mayor Hargrove was a substantial man in his 50s, his prosperous appearance slightly diminished by the strain evident in his face. He gestured for Hawkins and Eleanor to take the 2 remaining chairs in his well-appointed parlor. "Dr. Hawkins, thank you for coming," he began formally. "And Miss," he hesitated, eyeing Eleanor with unconcealed curiosity. "Eleanor Blackwood," she supplied. "Registered nurse from Philadelphia General Hospital." A murmur rippled through the gathered council. Members. A woman sitting primly in a high-backed chair, presumably Mrs. Henderson, leaned forward with interest. "The lady Thomas Bennett was expecting to marry?" "The same," Eleanor acknowledged, maintaining her composure under their collective scrutiny. "Unfortunate timing, Miss Blackwood," Hargrove commented. "Arriving during a quarantine to find your intended has departed." "Fortunate timing for our patients," Hawkins interjected before Eleanor could respond. Miss Blackwood's training has already saved Patrick Donnelly's life and significantly improved our capacity to manage this outbreak. A thin man with spectacles, Wilson, Eleanor guessed from Hawkins's earlier description, cleared his throat skeptically. While we appreciate any medical assistance, there are questions about Miss Blackwood's presence during a legally enforced quarantine. Sheriff Walsh informs us she arrived after the territorial governor issued isolation orders. Technically correct, Hawkins conceded. However, Miss Blackwood arrived before Sheriff Walsh returned with the official documentation. More importantly, the quarantine order contains specific exemptions for essential medical personnel, which Miss Blackwood unquestionably qualifies as. Reverend Taylor, distinguished by his clerical collar, spoke for the first time. No one questions the value of medical assistance, Dr. Hawkins. However, there are concerns about propriety as well as quarantine regulations. Eleanor straightened in her chair. If I may address both concerns directly, she said, her voice steady. Regarding quarantine regulations, I've maintained strict isolation within the clinic and medical grounds since my arrival, following the same protocols Dr. Hawkins observes. As for propriety, I maintain separate quarters within the clinic and interact with Dr. Hawkins solely in a professional capacity as his medical assistant. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. It must have been quite a shock to arrive and find Dr. Bennett gone. It was unexpected, Eleanor acknowledged diplomatically. However, the current health crisis takes precedence over personal disappointments. Bancroft, a ruddy-faced man with calloused hands that spoke of his work at the sawmill, cut through the social niceties. Propriety aside, we're here about the quarantine itself. It's been nearly 3 weeks. People are running out of supplies. The Hammond family has been eating nothing but dried beans for 5 days. The Miller children haven't had milk since their cow went dry last week. Hargrove nodded soberly. While we understand the medical necessity, Dr. Hawkins, the practical reality is that White Rock wasn't prepared for extended isolation. If we don't get supplies soon, we'll be facing starvation alongside this fever. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Hawkins, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to present her proposal. If I may, she began. In Philadelphia, we implemented structured resource sharing during quarantines. Each household would report their supplies, and a central committee would organize fair distribution to ensure no family faced severe deprivation, while others maintained surplus. The council members exchanged thoughtful looks at this suggestion. Additionally, Eleanor continued, while maintaining strict quarantine of the town itself, it might be possible to establish a secure transfer point at the town boundary where territorial officials could deliver essential supplies without direct contact with townspeople. Hawkins built upon her proposal. Sheriff Walsh could oversee such transfers, ensuring no physical contact occurs while still allowing critical provisions to enter White Rock. An interesting compromise, Hargrove mused. Maintains medical isolation while addressing practical needs. I've seen such arrangements work effectively during yellow fever outbreaks in Philadelphia, Eleanor added. With proper protocols, the risk of contagion spread is minimal, while the benefit to community welfare is substantial. Reverend Taylor nodded approvingly. A balanced approach that addresses both body and spirit. Our community needs hope as much as medicine. The discussion evolved into practical planning, with Wilson appointed to inventory available food supplies throughout town, and Mrs. Henderson tasked with organizing fair distribution. Bancroft, initially the most vocal opponent of continued quarantine, seemed mollified by the prospect of supply delivery and agreed to coordinate construction of a transfer station at the town's edge. As the meeting progressed, Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in how the council members addressed her, from initial skepticism to increasing inclusion in their planning discussions. By the time they concluded, her suggestion had transformed into a comprehensive community strategy that retained medical safeguards while addressing practical needs. "You've provided a valuable perspective, Miss Blackwood," Hargrove acknowledged, as the meeting adjourned. "Perhaps Thomas Bennett's misfortune has proven White Rock's benefit." Walking back toward the clinic in the fading afternoon light, Hawkins broke his customary reserve. "That was masterfully handled. You found the middle path when they could only see extremes." "Philadelphia's hospitals taught me that medical directives must account for human realities," Eleanor replied. "The best treatment plan fails if patients cannot comply with it. A wisdom many physicians never acquire," Hawkins observed, "including perhaps Thomas Bennett." The mention of her former fiancé reminded Eleanor of questions that had lingered since her arrival. "You've been diplomatic about Dr. Bennett, but I sense there's more to his departure than his illness alone would explain." Hawkins walked several paces in silence before responding. Bennett was a competent physician with modern training, which White Rock desperately needed. But when the fever struck, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some doctors are suited for routine medicine, but falter in crisis." Bennett became increasingly disturbed by the conditions, the lack of proper facilities, the limited supplies, the seemingly unending stream of new cases. "He was afraid," Eleanor surmised. "Not without reason," Hawkins acknowledged fairly. "The fever has claimed 3 physicians in neighboring settlements, but a doctor who abandons his patients during an outbreak." The unfinished thought conveyed volumes about Hawkins's own medical ethics. Eleanor considered what might have awaited her had Bennett remained, marriage to a man who prioritized self-preservation over professional duty, a fundamental conflict with her own principles of service. "The town council seems to hold you in high regard despite what you described as mere tolerance," she observed, changing the subject. "Crisis clarifies essential values," Hawkins replied. "When fever strikes, heritage becomes secondary to healing skill. Once the epidemic passes," he shrugged slightly, "old prejudices will likely resurface." At the clinic, they found Patrick Donnelly sitting up for the first time, accepting broth from one of the recovering patients who had begun assisting with simple tasks. The overall atmosphere had improved markedly since Eleanor's arrival. Windows were opened regularly to admit fresh air, bedding was changed daily rather than when absolutely necessary, and patients were positioned optimally to ease breathing. "Difficulties. Your Philadelphia training has transformed our little clinic," Hawkins observed as they reviewed patient progress. "I've practiced more effective medicine these past days with your assistance than I managed in weeks alone." "Your indigenous remedies have proven equally valuable," Eleanor countered honestly. "The Mullin compound has been more effective for lung congestion than any treatment I administered in Philadelphia." Their mutual professional respect had deepened steadily through shared challenges and complementary approaches. Eleanor found herself increasingly valuing Hawkins's quiet competence, ethical commitment, and integration of diverse medical traditions. For his part, Hawkins had gradually relaxed his initial reserve, sharing more of his medical insights and occasionally revealing glimpses of the person behind the physician. As evening approached, a knock at the clinic door interrupted their work. Sheriff Walsh entered, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "Doc, Miss Blackwood," he acknowledged them, "got something for you to consider." He hesitated, then continued. "Mayor's been corresponding with the territorial governor by telegraph. Governor's agreed to allow supply deliveries using your transfer station idea, Miss Blackwood." "That's excellent news," Eleanor responded, noting the sheriff's lingering discomfort. "But there's something else troubling you." Walsh nodded, removing his hat. "Governor's man wants something in exchange for expediting supplies. He's requested that you both travel to the Blackfoot settlement north of here. They've reported fever cases, and with no doctor for 30 miles, they're facing significant losses. Hawkins frowned. Leaving White Rock now would be irresponsible with patients still recovering. Most are past the critical stage, Walsh countered. Mrs. Henderson and Reverend Taylor have volunteered to manage basic care, following your instructions. It would be 4 days, 2 to travel, 1 to treat, 1 to return. And if we refuse? Eleanor asked, sensing unstated consequences. Governor's office might question your status as essential medical personnel exempt from quarantine restrictions, Miss Blackwood, Walsh admitted reluctantly. Might also delay approval for supply deliveries while considering the matter. The implied threat was clear. Eleanor's position remained precarious in official eyes, and the town's needed supplies hung in the balance. Hawkins's expression darkened. Bureaucratic extortion dressed as humanitarian concern. Politics and medicine make poor bedfellows, Walsh agreed with unexpected sympathy. For what it's worth, I argued against putting you in this position. But the territorial governor's man was quite adamant. After the sheriff departed, Hawkins paced the clinic with rare agitation. They're leveraging your vulnerable position and the town's needs to force medical service without proper support or protection. It's unconscionable. Eleanor considered the situation from all angles. The Blackfoot truly need medical assistance? Undoubtedly, Hawkins confirmed. If fever has reached their settlement, they'll be suffering severely without treatment. But the journey is difficult, and we'd have limited supplies to transport. Then perhaps we should view this as a medical necessity rather than political manipulation, Eleanor suggested pragmatically. Regardless of the governor's motives, there are people who need our help. Hawkins studied her with intensity. You'd willingly undertake this journey. It would mean rough travel, basic conditions, and potential hostility from some in the settlement who distrust white medicine. I came west seeking purpose beyond Boston's constraints, Eleanor replied with growing certainty. If that purpose now involves treating fever cases in a Blackfoot settlement, so be it. Something shifted in Hawkins's expression, respect mingled with concern. You continue to defy expectations, Miss Blackwood, but if we undertake this journey together, you should know what it means for your reputation in territorial society. An unmarried woman traveling alone with a half-Comanche man, regardless of professional purpose. My reputation matters less than saving lives, Eleanor stated firmly. Besides, I'm already the abandoned bride who arrived during quarantine and appointed herself nurse to a frontier town. Conventional society would find little to salvage in my situation regardless. The frankness of her assessment drew a genuine smile from Hawkins, perhaps the first unguarded expression she'd witnessed from him. Then we'll prepare to depart tomorrow at first light. I'll inform Walsh of our decision and request the necessary travel provisions. As she packed medical supplies for their journey, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary path that had led her from proper Philadelphia nurse to quarantined frontier town, and now toward a Native American settlement. None of these developments aligned with the future she had envisioned while corresponding with Thomas Bennett. Yet, strangely, she felt more alive and purposeful than at any previous point in her life. The constraints of Eastern propriety had fallen away, allowing her to fully embrace her medical calling without artificial limitations. And in Dr. James Hawkins, she had found a medical partner who valued her abilities without reservation, something no physician in Philadelphia had ever truly offered. Dawn arrived with a thin blanket of frost covering White Rock, the overnight. Chill, a stark reminder that Montana's harsh winter approached. Eleanor packed the final items into her medical bag: bandages, tinctures prepared from Sarah Whitehorse's herbs, and the precious remaining quinine. Her practical traveling dress and sturdy boots replaced the more formal attire she had worn. To meet the town council, Hawkins waited by the clinic door with Sheriff Walsh. who had arrived with the promised supplies and transportation, a wagon loaded with basic provisions and 2 sturdy horses for the journey's rougher terrain. The trail to the Blackfoot settlement follows Buffalo Creek for most of the way. Walsh explained as he handed Hawkins a roughly drawn map. It's passable by wagon for the first day. After that, you'll need to ride horseback through the highlands. Eleanor approached, her medical bag and a small pack containing personal necessities in hand. Walsh's expression registered surprise at her practical frontier attire, so different from the Eastern dresses she had worn previously. "Miss Blackwood," he acknowledged with newfound respect. "Mayor Hargrove asked me to convey the town's appreciation for your willingness to undertake this journey. The town's resources will be distributed while we're gone," she confirmed. Walsh nodded. "First inventory was completed last night. Mrs. Henderson's already organizing fair allocation. The transfer station for new supplies should be constructed by tomorrow." "And our patients?" Hawkins inquired, his primary concern evident. "Reverend Taylor's wife has nursing experience from back east," Walsh assured him. "She'll follow your written instructions for care. The patients showing good recovery will help with the simpler tasks." Hawkins secured their medical supplies. In the wagon, while Eleanor made a final check of their most critical patients, Patrick Donnelly, now conscious and improving steadily, watched her preparations with concern. "Heard you're heading to the Blackfoot settlement," he commented as she checked his breathing. "Brave undertaking, especially for an Eastern lady." "Necessary undertaking," Eleanor corrected gently. "People are ill and need medical attention." Donnelly's weathered face creased in a weak smile. "You're not what anyone expected when we heard. Doc Bennett was bringing a bride from Philadelphia. Think most figured you'd be crying to return east by now." "Life rarely conforms to expectations, Mr. Donnelly," Eleanor replied, adjusting his pillows to ease his breathing. "Sometimes it offers something entirely different, and occasionally better than what we anticipated." "Doc Hawkins is a good man," Donnelly said unexpectedly. "Gets treated poorly by some because of his heritage, but he saved plenty who'd never invite him to dinner afterward. Different kind of courage, sticking to healing folks who don't always show proper gratitude." The miner's insight surprised Eleanor. "You seem to hold him in high regard." "Worked these mountains 15 years, Donnelly said simply. "Learned to judge men by their actions, not their bloodlines. Doc Hawkins is worth 10 of most men I've met, including plenty who claim finer breeding." This unvarnished assessment from a rough frontier miner confirmed Eleanor's growing appreciation for Hawkins's character. His quiet competence, ethical commitment, and dignified perseverance, despite the prejudice he clearly faced in White Rock. As Eleanor joined Hawkins at the wagon, she noticed a small gathering had formed to see them off, not just the town officials, but several recovered patients and their families. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, pressing a package into Eleanor's hands. "Biscuits and preserved fruit for your journey," she explained. "And," her voice lowered confidentially, "a letter addressed to you arrived yesterday on the Territorial Governor's courier. I took the liberty of collecting it before it became an official matter." Eleanor accepted the letter with surprise, immediately recognizing Thomas Bennett's handwriting on the envelope. Mrs. Henderson patted her arm sympathetically before stepping back. With final instructions given and goodbyes exchanged, Hawkins helped Eleanor onto the wagon seat before taking the reins. As they departed White Rock under the watchful eyes of its citizens, Eleanor became acutely aware of the unusual nature of their journey. An unmarried Eastern woman and a half-Comanche doctor traveling alone to a Native American settlement. The conventions of Philadelphia society seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant in the face of medical necessity and the stark realities of frontier life. She felt a surprising sense of liberation as the wagon left the town behind, the open landscape replacing White Rock's watching eyes and whispered judgments. Once they were well beyond town, Eleanor opened Bennett's letter, curiosity overcoming her initial reluctance. "My dear Miss Blackwood, word has reached me in Denver of your arrival in White Rock and the unfortunate circumstances you encountered. I must express my deepest regrets for the situation and attempt to explain my abrupt departure. My condition deteriorated rapidly as the fever spread through town. Dr. Hawkins advised immediate relocation to Denver's hospital facilities as my lungs showed concerning damage that would likely worsen in White Rock's conditions. In my fevered state, I fear I failed to consider your imminent arrival or arrange proper communication. I am told you have admirably stepped into a nursing role during the crisis, which speaks to the character I believed you possessed from our correspondence. When the quarantine lifts, I hope you might consider joining me in Denver to discuss our future arrangements once my health improves. With sincere regrets and continued affection, Thomas Bennett." MD Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her emotions more complex than she had anticipated. Bennett's explanation seemed reasonable on its surface, a gravely ill man making hasty decisions to preserve his health. Yet the absence of any attempt to warn her, the ease with which he had abandoned his patients, and his assumption that she would simply wait for their future arrangements to be discussed, revealed a character fundamentally at odds with her own principles. Hawkins had maintained a respectful silence during her reading, his attention apparently focused on guiding the horses along the increasingly rough trail. His profile against the morning light showed the distinctive features of his mixed heritage, the prominent cheekbones and straight nose that spoke of his Comanche bloodline blended with traits from his white father. "Dr. Bennett has written," she said finally, "explaining his departure and suggesting I join him in Denver when the quarantine lifts." Hawkins's expression remained carefully neutral. A reasonable hope on his part. "Is it?" Eleanor found herself asking. "A man who abandons his patients during an outbreak, fails to warn his fiancée of danger, and then expects her to simply wait for his convenience?" "Perhaps fever clouded his judgment," Hawkins suggested with diplomatic fairness. "Illness can distort one's thinking." "True illness, yes," Eleanor conceded. "But I've seen physicians prioritize their safety over patient care in Philadelphia as well. It speaks to character rather than circumstance." Hawkins was silent for a moment before responding. "What will you do when the quarantine lifts?" The question had occupied Eleanor's thoughts increasingly over the past days. "I'm no longer certain," she admitted. "When I left Philadelphia, my path seemed clear. Marriage to a frontier doctor and establishing a respectable position in a growing western town. Now," she gestured to the expansive landscape around them, "everything has changed, including, perhaps, what I truly want." "The frontier has that effect," Hawkins observed. "It strips away societal layers until essential truths remain. Some find that uncomfortable, and others find it clarifying," Eleanor added, realizing the truth of her words as she spoke them. They traveled in companionable silence as the trail followed Buffalo Creek through increasingly rugged country. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a simple meal beside the creek. Eleanor used the opportunity to organize their medical supplies more efficiently for the cases they might encounter at the Blackfoot settlement. "Have you treated many Native American patients?" she asked as they prepared to continue their journey. "Regularly," Hawkins replied, "though my mixed heritage creates complications. Some tribes view me with suspicion as too white, while others accept my medical knowledge because of my Comanche blood." He secured their provisions in the wagon. "The Blackfoot have generally been accepting of my treatments, particularly after I successfully managed a measles outbreak among their children last year. Will my presence create additional difficulties?" Eleanor asked practically. "Possibly. he acknowledged. "Though your nursing credentials will help, the settlement we're visiting has had more contact with white society than most. Their chief running elk has even sent several children to the territorial school when epidemics aren't closing it." As the afternoon progressed, the terrain grew increasingly challenging. The wagon creaked and swayed over the rough trail, forcing them to proceed at a cautious pace. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed dramatically as it wound into higher elevations. "We'll make camp here," Hawkins decided, finding a relatively flat area near a small tributary of Buffalo Creek. "Tomorrow we'll continue on horseback. The wagon won't manage the highland trails ahead." Eleanor helped establish their camp with practical efficiency, surprising Hawkins with her willingness to handle the less genteel aspects of frontier travel. She gathered firewood while he secured the horses, then assisted in preparing a simple meal from their provisions. As darkness fell, the vast Montana sky revealed a spectacular array of stars unlike anything Eleanor had witnessed in Philadelphia's light-polluted skies. She sat wrapped in a blanket near the fire, gazing upward in genuine wonder. "It's magnificent," she breathed. "In Philadelphia, we see only the brightest stars through the coal smoke and gas lighting." Hawkins looked up from tending the fire, his expression softening at her evident appreciation. "My mother's people believe the stars are ancestors watching over their descendants," he said quietly. "On nights like this, such beliefs seem entirely reasonable." The personal revelation, a rare insight into his cultural heritage, touched Eleanor deeply. "A beautiful perspective," she replied. "Certainly more comforting than mere balls of gas burning millions of miles away, as my science teachers insisted. Perhaps truth accommodates multiple perspectives," Hawkins suggested. "Western medicine saves lives with surgery and pharmaceuticals. My mother's people healed with plants and spiritual practices for centuries before Europeans arrived. Both approaches contain validity." This philosophical openness, so different from the rigid doctrinal adherence of many physicians Eleanor had known in Philadelphia, reflected the integrative approach she had observed in Hawkins's medical practice. "Integration rather than exclusion," she mused, "a principle that might benefit medicine broadly if more practitioners adopted it. And perhaps other aspects of society as well," Hawkins added meaningfully. Their conversation drifted to practical matters, the cases they might encounter at the settlement, the supplies they had brought, and protocols for treating fever in limited conditions. Throughout their discussion, Eleanor noted the natural equality with which Hawkins engaged her medical knowledge, a professional respect she had rarely experienced from physicians in Philadelphia. As they prepared to sleep, Hawkins on one side of the fire, Eleanor on the other, propriety maintained even in the wilderness, she found herself contemplating the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A month ago, she had been packing her trunks in Philadelphia, anticipating a conventional marriage to a frontier doctor she knew only through letters. Now she sat beneath Montana's star-filled sky, preparing to treat epidemic victims in a Native American settlement, alongside a Half-Comanche physician who valued her medical expertise without reservation. The path had diverted dramatically from her expectations, yet somehow aligned more authentically with her deepest aspirations. As she drifted toward sleep, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, Eleanor recognized that White Rock's quarantine, initially appearing as disaster, had perhaps delivered her precisely where she needed to be. Morning arrived with a thin mist hanging over the valley, the autumn air sharp with the scent of pine and approaching winter. Eleanor woke to find Hawkins already preparing a small breakfast over the rekindled fire, coffee brewing in a battered pot. "The highlands will be significantly colder," he informed her as he handed her a steaming cup. "We should layer our clothing appropriately." They ate quickly, packed their essential supplies onto the horses, and secured the wagon for their return journey. Eleanor had ridden occasionally in Philadelphia's parks, but found mounting the sturdy mare Hawkins had selected for her a different challenge entirely. After her second awkward attempt, Hawkins approached. "May I assist you?" he asked, with professional courtesy. At her nod, he positioned his hands respectfully at her waist and boosted her into the saddle with surprising gentleness for a man of his strength. The brief contact, practically necessary but socially improper by Eastern standards, highlighted again how conventional propriety bent to practical needs on the frontier. The trail narrowed as they climbed, eventually becoming little more than a game path winding through stands of lodgepole pine and across rocky slopes. Eleanor's riding skills improved through necessity, her body gradually adjusting to the rhythm of the horse's movements over challenging terrain. "You adapt quickly," Hawkins observed, after several hours of difficult riding. "Many Easterners struggle significantly with frontier travel." "Adaptation seems the essential skill of frontier life," Eleanor replied, secretly pleased by the compliment. "Those who cling to Eastern habits likely suffer unnecessarily." "A wise observation," Hawkins agreed. "I've seen many newcomers resist the necessary adjustments until hardship forces change." By midday, they had climbed high enough to see the sprawling landscape below, Buffalo Creek winding through the valley they had traversed, and far in the distance, the faint outline of White Rock itself. The perspective was both literally and figuratively enlightening, offering Eleanor a broader view of the territory that might become her permanent home. "It's breathtaking," she commented as they paused to rest the horses. "Philadelphia has its beauties, but nothing that expands the spirit quite like this." "The vastness changes one's perspective," Hawkins agreed. "Problems that loom large in town often shrink when viewed against this landscape." Their philosophical exchange was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching from farther up the trail. Hawkins immediately grew alert, moving his hand to the rifle secured to his saddle. "Stay behind me," he instructed quietly. "Most travelers in these highlands are peaceful, but caution is prudent." Within minutes, two riders appeared around a bend in the trail, Native Americans on sturdy ponies. They halted at sight of Hawkins, and Eleanor, studying them with careful assessment before the older rider raised his hand in greeting. "James Hawkins," the man called in accented but clear English. "Running Elk sends us to find you." Hawkins relaxed visibly, returning the greeting. "Swift Arrow," he acknowledged. "How did Running Elk know we were coming?" "Territorial agent sent message yesterday," Swift Arrow explained, guiding his pony closer. His gaze shifted curiously to Eleanor. "Said doctor bringing white medicine? A woman to help with fever. This is Eleanor Blackwood," Hawkins introduced her. "Trained nurse from Philadelphia." Swift Arrow nodded respectfully. "Many sick in settlement. Children suffering worst. Running Elk loses youngest son 2 days past." The news sobered them immediately. "How many ill?" Hawkins inquired. 23, Swift Arrow replied grimly. 6 already walking with ancestors. "We brought medical supplies," Eleanor interjected, her professional concern overriding any hesitation about addressing their guides directly, including treatments specifically for fever and lung congestion. Swift Arrow's companion, who had remained silent, studied Eleanor with increased interest at this declaration. He spoke rapidly to Swift Arrow in their native language. "Grey Wolf asks if White Medicine Woman knows fever signs before spots show," Swift Arrow translated. "His daughter sick but no spots yet. Early symptoms include high temperature, severe headache and body aches," Eleanor responded promptly. "Rash typically appears on the 3rd or 4th day of fever. Is that what you're seeing in the settlement?" After Swift Arrow translated, Grey Wolf nodded gravely. "Sounds consistent with spotted fever," Hawkins noted to Eleanor. "Different from White Rock's outbreak, which presents primarily with respiratory symptoms." "We should continue immediately," Eleanor urged, thinking of the suffering children awaiting their help. With Swift Arrow and Grey Wolf now leading, they proceeded at a quicker pace through the highlands. The Native Americans navigated the difficult terrain with practiced ease, occasionally waiting for Hawkins and Eleanor to navigate particularly challenging passages. "How long have you known Running Elk?" Eleanor asked Hawkins as they rode. 5 years, he replied. "I treated his wife for a difficult childbirth when no one else would come to the settlement. He's progressive for a traditional leader, sees value in both cultures rather than rejecting all white ways." "Will my presence be accepted?" she inquired practically. "As a healer, yes," Hawkins assured her, "though they may test your knowledge and commitment before fully trusting your treatments." By late afternoon, they crested a final ridge and saw the Blackfoot settlement spread across a protected valley below. Perhaps 30 structures arranged in a traditional circular pattern around a central common area. Unlike the stereotypical teepees Eleanor had seen in Eastern illustrations, these were substantial wooden structures built for permanent occupation, with only a few hide dwellings at the periphery. Smoke rose from most lodges, and several figures moved through the settlement performing daily tasks despite the illness present. As they descended toward the valley, Eleanor noted carefully tended garden plots, corrals for horses, and other signs of a stable, established community that contradicted Eastern notions of wild Indians constantly on the move. They've adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential cultural practices, Hawkins observed, noting her interest. Running Elk understands that flexibility ensures survival when traditional ways alone might fail. As they approached the settlement, several figures emerged from the largest structure to meet them. A tall, distinguished man of perhaps 50 years, wearing a blend of traditional buckskins and a white man's shirt, led the greeting party. His face showed the strain of recent grief, yet maintained dignified composure. "Running Elk," Hawkins greeted him respectfully in English. "Hawk's son," the chief replied, using what Eleanor presumed was Hawkins's Comanche name. "You bring help for my people." "This is Eleanor Blackwood," Hawkins introduced her, "trained in Philadelphia's best hospital for treating fevers." Running Elk studied Eleanor with penetrating intelligence. "The agent said medicine woman coming, did not say she would have sky in her eyes." The poetic reference to her blue eyes caught Eleanor by surprise, but she maintained professional composure. "I've brought medicines and knowledge to help your people, Chief Running Elk. I'm sorry about your son." Running Elk's expression revealed momentary surprise at her direct acknowledgement of his loss, something Eleanor suspected many whites might avoid mentioning. "You speak truth plainly," he observed. "Good quality in healer. Come, see our sick." He led them to a large lodge that had been converted to care for multiple patients. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of illness, smoke from medicinal fires, and the distinctive sweet-sour smell that accompanied high fevers. About 15 patients lay on pallets arranged around the space, tended by several women who moved quietly among them, applying damp cloths to foreheads and helping the conscious ones drink herbal teas. Eleanor's professional assessment began. Immediately, noting the characteristic rash on several patients, the positions of those struggling to breathe, and the different stages of illness represented. Without waiting for formal invitation, she removed her riding gloves, washed her hands in a nearby water basin, and moved to the nearest child, a girl of perhaps 7 whose flushed face and labored breathing indicated advanced fever. "May I?" she asked the woman tending the child, gesturing toward the small patient. After a nod from Running Elk, the woman stepped aside. Eleanor gently examined the girl, checking her pulse, respiration, and the distribution of the rash across her torso. She spoke softly to the child throughout, explaining each action, though she knew the girl likely didn't understand her words. "Spotted fever, as you suspected," she confirmed to Hawkins, who had begun his own examination of another patient. This child needs willow bark tea for the fever and cool compresses. The rash is extensive, but not yet showing the dangerous purple coloration. For the next hour, they moved methodically through the lodge, examining each patient and categorizing them by severity. Eleanor noticed that while the women initially watched her with uncertainty, they gradually began to assist as they observed. Her gentle, competent care and Hawkins's evident respect for her assessments. Outside the lodge afterward, they consulted with Running Elk about their findings. 8 critical cases requiring constant attention, Hawkins summarized. 7 moderate cases that should recover with proper care, and the remainder showing early symptoms that proper treatment might minimize. We need to establish clear protocols that your people can continue after we depart, Eleanor added. Different treatments for different stages of illness, isolation practices to prevent further spread, and proper nutrition to support recovery. Running Elk considered their assessment. You will stay tonight in my lodge. Tomorrow we build separate healing place for worst sick, as you suggest. He studied Eleanor with renewed interest. Medicine woman knows spotted fever well. I've treated similar outbreaks in Philadelphia, Eleanor explained. Though your people may have traditional remedies that could complement our treatments, I would welcome learning approaches that have proven effective. This respectful acknowledgement of indigenous knowledge clearly surprised and pleased Running Elk. My sister Bluefeather knows plant medicines. She will speak with you while Hawk's son helps build new lodge. As darkness fell, the settlement's routine continued despite the illness present. Children played quietly near their family dwellings, women prepared evening meals, and men gathered for council discussions about hunting and settlement defense. Eleanor observed this normalcy amid crisis with appreciation, recognizing the resilience it demonstrated. In Running Elk's spacious lodge, his wife Morning Star served a simple but nourishing meal of venison stew and corn cakes. Though still grieving her lost son, she conducted her duties as hostess with quiet dignity that Eleanor found deeply moving. After the meal, Bluefeather arrived, a striking woman perhaps 10 years older than Eleanor, with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. She carried a bundle of various plants and roots, laying them carefully on a woven mat between herself and Eleanor. My brother says you wish to know our medicines, she stated in surprisingly good English. If you're willing to share your knowledge, Eleanor confirmed. I believe healing benefits from multiple traditions. Bluefeather studied her thoughtfully before nodding once in approval. Most white healers think only their ways have value. Short-sighted perspective, Eleanor replied. Your people have survived on this land for generations. That survival certainly included effective medical treatments. This frank acknowledgement seemed to satisfy Bluefeather, who began systematically showing Eleanor the various plants she had brought, explaining their uses, preparation methods, and specific applications for fever symptoms. Many aligned with Western herbal knowledge Eleanor had studied, but several were entirely new to her. Watching from across the lodge, Hawkins and Running Elk observed this exchange of knowledge with evident approval. The medicine woman has unusual respect for our ways, Running Elk commented quietly. Miss Blackwood is exceptional in many regards, Hawkins acknowledged, his tone conveying more than his measured words. Running Elk studied his friend carefully. The territorial agent said she came to marry another doctor, but found him gone. Now she works with you instead. Temporary circumstances, Hawkins replied, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty about this assessment. Running Elk's weathered face showed a hint of amusement. Sometimes Great Spirit brings healing to the healer in unexpected ways. The philosophical observation hung between them as they watched Eleanor and Bluefeather continue their earnest exchange of medical knowledge. Two women from vastly different worlds, finding common ground in their shared commitment to healing. 3 days in the Blackfoot settlement, transformed both the community's health crisis and Eleanor's perspective on her future. Working alongside Bluefeather and the settlement's women, she had implemented a comprehensive treatment program that combined Western medical protocols with effective indigenous remedies. The results proved remarkably successful. No new deaths occurred after their arrival, and most patients showed significant improvement. The makeshift hospital lodge they had constructed provided proper isolation for the most severely ill, while preventative measures reduced new infections. Eleanor had carefully documented the effective combinations of treatments, creating written protocols that Bluefeather could continue implementing after their departure. Their final morning in the settlement found Eleanor kneeling beside the young girl she had first treated upon arrival. The child's fever had broken during the night, and though still weak, she now sat up taking spoonfuls of broth from her mother. "She recovers well," Bluefeather observed, joining Eleanor. "Her spirit is strong." Eleanor nodded, genuine relief evident in her expression. "All our critical patients have stabilized. I believe the worst of the crisis has passed." The women had developed a strong mutual respect during their collaboration, each recognizing the valuable knowledge the other possessed. Bluefeather had taught Eleanor indigenous uses of local plants that proved remarkably effective against the fever's symptoms, while Eleanor had contributed antiseptic techniques and diagnostic approaches that complemented traditional methods. "Your medicines and ours work better together than alone," Bluefeather observed thoughtfully. "Like your people and mine might, if pride did not stand between." "Wisdom often requires looking beyond established boundaries," Eleanor agreed, thinking how far her own perspective had expanded since leaving Philadelphia. Outside the hospital lodge, preparations for their departure were underway. Running Elk had assigned Swift Arrow and 2 other men to accompany them back to White Rock, ensuring safe passage through territories where tension between settlers and indigenous people occasionally flared into violence. Hawkins secured their supplies to the horses, his movements efficient yet somehow reluctant. Eleanor recognized her own mixed feelings about returning to White Rock, reflected in his demeanor. Pride in what they had accomplished here balanced against uncertainty about what awaited them. "The settlement owes you great debt," Running Elk stated, as they prepared to mount their horses, "especially the medicine woman with sky eyes." "I've gained as much knowledge as I've shared," Eleanor replied honestly. "Bluefeather is a gifted healer." Running Elk nodded approval at this acknowledgement. "When fever comes again, we will remember your teachings as you remember hers. This is how wisdom grows." He presented Eleanor with a small, beautifully beaded medicine bag. "Bluefeather sends this for your healing work. Contains sacred plants from our lands." The unexpected gift touched Eleanor deeply. "Please, thank her for her generosity. I'll treasure both the medicines and the knowledge she shared." As they rode away from the settlement, Eleanor felt a sense of accomplishment, unlike anything she had experienced in Philadelphia's hospital wards. There, her contributions had often been minimized or attributed to supervising physicians. Here, her knowledge had been valued, her leadership acknowledged, and her adaptability rewarded with new insights. Their journey back through the highlands proceeded efficiently under Swift Arrow's guidance. By nightfall, they had descended to the valley, where they had left the wagon, making camp beside Buffalo Creek as before. After their Native American escorts helped establish camp and then withdrew to give them privacy, Eleanor and Hawkins found themselves alone for the first time since beginning their journey. The silence between them carried the weight of unspoken questions about what would follow their return to White Rock. "You were remarkable with the Blackfoot," Hawkins said finally, breaking the contemplative silence. "Few white medical practitioners would have shown such respect for their traditional knowledge. Their approaches contained wisdom developed over generations," Eleanor replied. Dismissing effective treatments because they originated outside Western medicine would have been both arrogant and counter to patients' interests. Hawkins studied her across the campfire, the flickering light illuminating his features in a way that emphasized both his Comanche heritage and his thoughtful expression. "You continue to defy expectations, Eleanor," he observed, using her given name for the first time. The intimacy of this small change hung in the air between them. "Perhaps because I'm no longer certain whose expectations I'm meant to fulfill," she admitted. "Thomas Bennett's, Philadelphia Society's, or my own evolving understanding of what matters most." "And what does matter most?" Hawkins asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question with the honesty this extraordinary man deserved. "Using my medical knowledge to its fullest potential, working alongside someone who values that knowledge rather than constraining it, building something meaningful rather than merely decorative." She met his gaze directly. "What matters is purpose, James, and respect, and partnership based on mutual capability rather than conventional arrangements." The use of his given name, a conscious choice that matched his earlier intimacy, signaled her growing certainty about the path ahead, however unconventional it might appear to others. "When we return to White Rock," he said carefully, "you'll have options to consider. The quarantine will likely lift soon. Bennett's letter mentioned joining him in Denver." "A possibility I've contemplated," Eleanor acknowledged, "along with returning to Philadelphia, or perhaps seeking a position in one of the larger territorial towns with established hospitals." The practical options hung between them, reasonable paths that nonetheless felt increasingly hollow compared to what they had experienced working together. "And if there were another option?" Hawkins asked, his characteristic reserve giving way to cautious hope. "White Rock needs a permanent medical facility beyond my small clinic. The epidemic has demonstrated that clearly. With your nursing expertise and administrative experience, you're proposing a professional partnership?" Eleanor clarified, her heart quickening despite her outward composure. "Initially, yes," he confirmed, "though I hope you might consider that such arrangements could evolve if found mutually satisfactory." The careful phrasing concealed profound meaning. A frontier doctor of mixed heritage could not directly propose marriage to an educated Eastern woman without certain preliminaries, particularly one technically still committed to another physician. Yet the possibility hung clearly in his measured words. "A medical partnership would benefit White Rock considerably," Eleanor responded with matching care, "and might indeed naturally evolve if both parties found the arrangement fulfilling." The diplomatic exchange masked deeper emotions, evident in their expressions. Both understood the practical and social obstacles such a path would entail, yet also recognized the rare alignment of purpose, respect, and growing affection between them. The return journey to White Rock the following day revealed significant changes in the town. The transfer station at the boundary operated efficiently, with fresh supplies arriving under Sheriff Walsh's supervision. The resource-sharing program Eleanor had proposed functioned effectively, ensuring no family faced severe deprivation while others maintained surplus. Most importantly, the epidemic had clearly waned. No new cases had developed during their absence, and most patients had progressed to recovery. The quarantine would likely lift within days, according to territorial regulations. Eleanor's status in the community had transformed dramatically from her arrival just weeks earlier. Where once she had been viewed with suspicion as an outsider, of questionable standing, she now received genuine appreciation from townspeople who recognized her contributions during the crisis. Even Sheriff Walsh greeted her with newfound respect. "Your supply distribution system saved folks from desperate measures, Miss Blackwood," he acknowledged as they unloaded their equipment at the clinic. "And word of your work with the Blackfoot has already reached town. Territorial governors, mighty impressed." This official appreciation translated into a formal offer delivered the following day. a commission as nursing superintendent for the territory's newly planned network of frontier medical stations. The position would provide significant authority, respectable salary, and the opportunity to implement her ideas about integrated medicine throughout the region. A prestigious opportunity, Hawkins observed as they discussed the offer in the clinic that evening. Few women achieve such recognition, particularly in frontier territories. Indeed, Eleanor agreed, yet it would involve considerable travel between outposts, less direct patient care than I might prefer. The unspoken comparison to their proposed White Rock partnership hung between them. Before they could discuss it further, a messenger arrived with a telegram from Denver, Thomas Bennett, requesting Eleanor's immediate presence once the quarantine lifted, with funds enclosed for transportation. "It seems your options multiply," Hawkins commented, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension evident in his posture. That evening, Eleanor walked alone through White Rock's now active streets, contemplating the diverging paths before her. The territorial position offered professional prestige and independence. Bennett's telegram represented the conventional marriage she had originally journeyed west to secure, yet neither aligned with what she had discovered about herself and her deepest aspirations during White Rock's quarantine. Her feet carried her to the small church where Reverend Taylor stood, arranging hymnals for the following day's service. He greeted her warmly, having become an ally during the resource distribution efforts. "You seem troubled, Miss Blackwood," he observed with pastoral perception. "May I offer counsel?" Eleanor appreciated his direct approach. "I'm facing several paths forward, Reverend, each reasonable yet none entirely satisfying. And what would satisfy if convention and expectation were set aside?" he asked, with surprising insight. The question crystallized her thinking with unexpected clarity. "Remaining in White Rock," she admitted. "Establishing a proper medical facility with Dr. Hawkins, using our complementary skills to serve this community and the surrounding settlements, including the indigenous populations typically excluded from proper care." Taylor nodded thoughtfully. "I've observed your work together during this crisis. Rarely have I seen such natural partnership, each strengthening the other's capabilities rather than competing or constraining them." "Such arrangements would raise eyebrows even in frontier society," Eleanor noted practically. "Initially, perhaps," Taylor agreed, "though results tend to silence criticism eventually, and professional partnerships sometimes naturally evolve into more conventional arrangements when mutual respect is already established." His diplomatic phrasing echoed Hawkins's earlier approach, suggesting that the path Eleanor contemplated, while unconventional, was not without precedent or possibility. The following morning, Eleanor sent 3 responses to the opportunities. Before her, to the territorial governor, appreciation for the offered position but respectful declination. To Thomas Bennett, acknowledgement of his telegram with clear statement that their paths had diverged permanently. And to Mayor Hargrove and the town council, a formal proposal for establishing a permanent medical facility in White Rock, with herself and Dr. Hawkins as equal partners in its operation. Hawkins found her in the clinic garden, gathering the last herbs before winter's arrival. His expression as he approached held cautious hope mixed with uncertainty. "You've made your decision," he stated, sensing the resolution in her demeanor. "I have," Eleanor confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. "I came west seeking purpose and in partnership, James. I've found both in White Rock, though in entirely unexpected form." She handed him the copy of her proposal to the town council. "I've declined both the territorial position and Dr. Bennett's invitation. Instead, I've proposed we establish a permanent medical facility here with formal recognition of our partnership." His careful composure gave way to genuine emotion as he read her detailed proposal. Complete with administrative structure, integration of Western and indigenous medicine, and outreach to surrounding settlements, including the Blackfoot. "You've chosen to stay," he said simply, wonder evident in his voice. "I've chosen to build something meaningful," Eleanor corrected, gently, "with someone who values my knowledge and shares my vision. The circumstances are unconventional, but perhaps the frontier requires new approaches to both medicine and life's arrangements." Hawkins took her hand in a gesture that bridged professional appreciation and personal tenderness. "White Rock doesn't deserve you, Eleanor, but I promise to spend however long you remain here ensuring you never regret this choice." "I suspect that may be a considerable time," she replied with quiet certainty. "Perhaps even a lifetime." The austere Montana landscape stretched before them, winter's approach evident in the bare trees and frost-covered ground. Yet Eleanor felt only growing warmth as she contemplated the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived in White Rock, expecting conventional marriage to a man she barely knew, only to find quarantine, crisis, and an entirely different path forward. What had initially seemed disaster, an abandoned bride in a quarantined town, had transformed into the most authentic opportunity she had ever encountered. With James Hawkins, she had found not just professional respect, but genuine partnership that transcended society's narrow expectations. As they walked together toward the clinic to begin another day of healing work, Eleanor reflected that sometimes life's greatest blessings arrived disguised as its most devastating disappointments, a truth that applied equally to mail-order brides and half-Comanche doctors, building something remarkable in a small frontier town called White Rock. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.